So recently, there's been a lot of talk about this in general, a lot on Twitter and kind of other places. There's a lot of been news articles. So for everybody watching, if you don't know what de-dollarization is, first of all, go look it up. It's a good thing. But essentially, regarding the fact that the U.S. reserve currency will no longer be the reserve currency of the world, right? And the
Well,
dollar,
the US dollar will no longer be the reserve
correct.
currency.
And so a lot of people are quote unquote concerned about this, but then there are a lot of people who are on the other side of the fence and they're like, that's just not possible. So there's a guy named Peter Zeihan, I believe. We got a video sent in one of our chat groups regarding him. So Trent and I are just gonna watch the video, right? Figure out what his views are, what we think is he's right about, and what we kind of have concerns or kind of pushback about. So without further ado, let's start the video.
Yeah. And before I do that, I just wanted to give people a brief on Peter Zeihan because this is the first time
Hmm.
I'm finding out about him too. I'm just doing a quick Google search here on my phone. Looks like he is an American geopolitical analyst and author.
Yeah.
Do you know more about him? It sounds like you do, Cole.
Yeah, no, like I think you'll do a better job than me in terms of reading the bio, but he's pretty up there. Like he's not somebody who's just coming out of the mill out of nowhere, right? He's like not one of those Twitter kind of economists, etc.
Okay, yeah, it looks like he's been in the field for a long time. He has
Correct.
some degrees in it too. Okay.
Yeah,
I just wanted to get an idea of the background that he brings, what his
yeah.
perspective is.
Apparently, he's worked in consulting administrations in America as well. So it's not like
Okay.
he's definitely qualified to talk about these things. So he obviously knows more than us, I would say. But sometimes it's an interesting perspective because people can get blinders on when they're in a certain industry, right? And so it's just interesting to kind of see that happen.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's check it out.
All right, click.
All
You,
right.
you got the controls.
3, 2, 1, play.
Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Colorado, where the weather can't decide what it wants to do. Today it's sunny, so we're just going to work with it. A lot of you have written in asking me about all this hubbubaloo about de-dollarization. I'm like, this comes up every year or two, and so I have to explain it again. Fundamentally, nothing has really changed this time, but let me give you the 3 things to look for if you do want to take de-dollarization seriously in the future. This is not the time. Number 1, size. For a currency to be a currency of exchange, a currency of trade, and especially a currency of reserve, it has to exist in huge volume because it has to lubricate trillions of dollars of financial transactions and physical transactions every single day, and something in excess of $25-30 trillion of annual merchandise trade. That's a lot. And there are really only 4 currencies in the world that can even theoretically do that: the US dollar, the European euro, the Japanese yen, and the Chinese yuan. Okay,
Okay,
number
sorry.
1.
I'm gonna pause there for a second.
That's good. That's good.
He mentioned he mentioned liquidity, and Peter Zeihan,
Hmm.
I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. He doesn't believe in Bitcoin, but this is where I thought, or not believe in it because clearly it exists, but I don't think he believes that it could be the reserve currency by any means, or even could be a currency, etc. It can't be used for any of those things, and so I just think that this is one of the things where I'm like, yeah, those might not be options, but Bitcoin actually could be an option. It does have enough liquidity and it's not
Hmm.
priced the same, so it can be divided to 18 decimal points, right? So
Yeah.
you could potentially have the ability to facilitate a lot of these transactions, even though a lot of these whales have huge amounts of Bitcoin in those larger wallets. So there's only a little bit that's transactable, if you will. Did you have anything to say about that so far?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Size matters, especially when it comes to liquidity, and when it comes to your money. You want to have it in something where there is a lot of liquidity. So when it comes to a situation where you want access to your money, and if everyone wants access to it at the same time, there is enough of those monies to go around, or those currencies to go around. And it sounded like he was going to talk about the other major or big size currencies that have a lot of liquidity. I think he just touched on one yuan.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think USD by far has the most amount of liquidity, and that is definitely a big issue when you talk about, another currency trying to take over as the reserve. You have to
Hmm.
have liquidity. That's like
Yeah.
primary number one.
Right. Yep. Agreed. Right. Let's get back to it.
Okay, number 1. Number 2, access. you have to be able to get a hold of nearly unlimited volumes of that currency whenever you want to. Obviously, the dollar scratches that itch. The Japanese yen, not so much. The Japanese tried to go global back in the 1980s. Turns out their financial system couldn't handle it, and it contributed, was one of the many factors, as to why they have had, on average, 0% growth since 1993, 1994, something like that. And so they have kind of closed up shop. The currency is available. You can add it to the side, but it's never going to be a mainline exchange currency. Let's see. China is eliminated from that category as well. The number one concern that the Chinese have is for control, absolute, total, domineering, dictatorial control over their own internal financial sector. That means they don't want to see large cross-border flows, especially from China to the rest of the world. So every once in a while, the Chinese will do what they're doing now and talk up the yuan and talk up internationalization. And then as soon as it starts to happen, a flood of currency from the Chinese goes elsewhere because the Chinese are the people who are the least confident in their own economic system. And then the Chinese government slams it shut and we don't hear about it for a couple years again, like we are now. Okay, what's the big one? Trust. You have to trust that the currency is going to be worth something. You have to trust that the government's not going to intervene.
Sorry, I wanted to pause it there. So
Yeah.
yeah, the second point he was talking about was access to the currency. You want to have access to currency, and he's absolutely right about China. You know, you need to have access to the currency, and China is known to do things where they block access to their own citizens with certain things, right? They just work differently. It's a communist country, right? So I think that that whole aspect of getting access to the money or having the fear that they might just prohibit you from using your currency in certain situations, they're fully capable of doing something. And
Right.
I think that's a valid point. He was also talking about the yen.
Yeah.
And which is interesting because I never would picture using the yen. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Yeah.
Yeah, same. When he mentioned that, I was a bit surprised, but clearly I don't know enough about Japanese growth, but it seems to him that he's a real contender. He knows more about that part of the world than I do for sure. So I'll take his word for it.
I'm just gonna back up here.
And that means this is kind of a subset of trade. Now, with trade, if you are a major trading country and a large percentage of your GDP is gotten from exports and imports, then you have a vested interest in what the value of your currency is every single day. The U.S. is perfect for that because the U.S. trade to GDP ratio is only about 15%, and about half of that is either energy or NAFTA, and everything else falls into that other like 6-7%. So the United States really doesn't care what happens to the value of the currency every day. The Chinese don't have a freely traded system, so they can micromanage what the value is every single day. There's also the issue of whether your money's going to be there the next day. Now, the United States maybe has taken a hit on this with the Russia sanctions and that it's weaponized the US dollar in a few ways, but compare that to, say, what goes on with monetization. Now, I know a lot of you folks out there who are like gold bugs are like, oh, the US monetizes like mad. And, there's something to be said for that. We do have a large money supply. It's probably bigger than it needs to be, but a couple things to keep in mind. It's been shrinking for the last year as all the stimulus efforts from the last 15 years because of COVID and the financial crisis and everything else have finally wound down. It's going in the right direction. And second, I compare it to everyone else. The Japanese, the Europeans, and especially the Chinese print currency in far greater volumes than the U.S. does. So the U.S. currency is the primary finance currency. It's the primary currency in everyone's foreign reserves. It's the primary trade currency. It's the primary store of value. The Chinese yuan is none of those things. In fact, 99% of the issued currency of the Chinese yuan is held within the Chinese system, but their money supply is bigger than the United States because they print currency so ridiculously. So if you want to use that as a reason to talk down the dollar, that's fine. Just make sure you apply the same criteria to everyone else. Because the yen in the U.S., even though the Japanese economy is less than a third of the size of the U.S., it's about the same currency exchange, and the euro is bigger too. So the U.S. runs the least bad ship, if that's the right way to look at it. And then finally, of course, there's the euro. The Europeans for a long time have been mooting the U.S. dollar as a co-equal currency, if you will. The European euro should be right there with them. But they confiscated insured bank deposits back when they had their financial crisis in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And as a result, anyone who could move their money out of Europe did. So it's a regional currency, and that's not nothing, but it's no longer a serious contender for any sort of broad, dominant international role. There are a couple of other countries that have started to kind of join the shouting on this topic, but I don't take those seriously either. One of them is Bangladesh. Bangladesh has recently publicly pledged that the nuclear power plant that they're planning on buying from the Russians will be paid for with rubles. Yeah, that means nothing because the Bangladeshis don't have the money to buy a nuclear power plant. So to pledge for something that's never going to happen in a currency that they don't have, yeah, whatever. And then there's Argentina, who says it's gung-ho to join any sort of not dollar system. The Argentines are trailblazers in many financial matters, but currency adoption is not one of them. They're basically looking for currency that can be printed without causing inflation for them and without them having to pay back in foreign currency later. So, I wouldn't take that too seriously either. Now, all that said, there is one country out there that is seriously considering and maybe even implementing a degree of de-dollarization because it doesn't care about these factors. It has something else that is driving its decision making. And we'll talk about that tomorrow.
Ah, that
Oh wait, I want to know that.
yeah, that's a cliffhanger. Eh? He did a good job there. Um, but yeah, so I think it's interesting comments he made in general. I do believe that a lot of his concerns were solved by Bitcoin access. There's liquidity.
Trust.
There's trust. The only part I would say is
Bless you.
a concern is the fact that you don't have 100% trust that the governments won't actually shut it down, right? Now, technically you can't shut down Bitcoin, but they can introduce certain laws that if you're trading in it, you can't buy things with it, etc. And that just reduces mobility for the average consumer, right? They won't likely be able to prevent anybody from holding it because once you have it, you have it.
Mm.
It's there in Bitcoin and in the ledger, it won't change. What you can do is enforce some of those policies that just make it have less utility and therefore it reduces kind of the value of it. Now, I do think that there are some US states that are kind of going really hard on the other side, meaning Bitcoin for life, so to speak. So that I think will be helpful to the Bitcoin community, but I'm not sure if their whole financial system goes down, will they be forced to kind of push back on BTC to make sure that they survive, so to speak. So I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
About Bitcoin being the reserve
That and
currency?
then like would America push back if they see their system kind of crumbling
Mhm.
down? Do you think they'd be like, okay, maybe we don't support Bitcoin, even those states that are supporting Bitcoin at the moment?
Yeah, that will be tough because Bitcoin is so big already. And like you said, like you can't ban Bitcoin, but I guess you can ban how easily people can transact with it. Or, and by transact, I mean like, because when you're buying Bitcoin, you got to go through the current banking rails system in order to convert your fiat into Bitcoin, no matter where you are in the world, right? And I don't know if there's a system that exists where you can get access to Bitcoin without converting your fiat over a banking system. Go ahead, you're going to say.
Yeah, there are certain sites. We'll have to put them in the show notes where you can reach out to people in your local community, and you go directly to peer and say, "Hey, I'll give
Okay,
you some fiat, and you transfer me over Bitcoin you have, right?" So
sure,
that
sure.
can happen still, but
Yeah.
I think the utility, like you said, goes down, and then what happens if they prevent people from buying stuff? Then it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, but then, like you said, things can still happen. Like you could still do under the table business, like people have throughout generations with all kinds of things that are illegal. We could
Right.
talk about. Yeah, go ahead.
But that's what I'm saying. That like those fringe people that really believe in the ideology of Bitcoin, they will, right? Because
Hmm.
they think, okay, Bitcoin for life, so to speak, hodl. And the average consumer, they're going to be like, all right. So I'm huge. Obviously, you know this. I'm a huge proponent of Bitcoin. I
Same.
think these concerns, as a community, we should take seriously and figure out the answers to them, right? If someone's saying, if the government blocks any transaction from happening that's on Bitcoin, like an official transaction, meaning you go to, I don't know, like Pizza or something. You want to go get a pizza. That they're going to be forbidden because they're going to follow the laws overseas. They're a legitimate business. They're not going to start transacting in Bitcoin if the government says no, you cannot. It's not legal tender. You can't do that. Then what happens is you're never going to be able to buy any of those things. And then 90% of the population is going to be like, all right, then why am I going to get this thing if I can't actually use it?
What if you could instantly convert it into fiat upon the transaction being made? And
Right. And so
that exists already.
it does, but that only exists because the banking system and the government allow it. Because the companies
Hmm.
that are the transfer the rails between, they have to abide by the banking laws and things along those lines, right? And they're only allowed
Yeah.
to exist in that framework, right?
Yeah, I guess the other side to that is they could still benefit from transactions happening in Bitcoin.
Okay.
You could still benefit from taxes and things of that nature, right?
Right.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is like, what would incentivize them to ban it? Because it's so big that you could why not take advantage of it? You know,
Well,
introduce taxes, introduce
agreed.
anything where you can get a little piece of that, right?
I agree. I agree. And the issue is governments are slow, right? Like look at
Yeah.
cannabis. It was banned for so long, and then they're like, hang on a minute, we could tax this. Why didn't we think of this before? And why was anybody progressive enough to do this? And so it's like it just takes time sometimes, right? Where when they finally see a benefit in it, they will. I'm not saying like maybe the cannabis call was wrong or not. It doesn't matter, but it allows the government to have more tax revenue because of it. And so I don't know. I think and Bitcoin is the perfect kind of like method to tax if you could, right? Because let's say you have those official accounts, that's where you get paid, etc. You have to hook it up to some system that essentially like you say this is my official bank account, and now you whenever money comes in there, the bank can see it. It's an open ledger. You
Hmm.
can see, and now there's like kind of what is it called? Uh, Companies that actually track like exactly what accounts are related, etc. They can figure out exactly which account belongs to who, and now you can do analysis on them and figure out if people are taking money or what doing under the
Doing
table
legal
deals.
stuff. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. So it just doesn't make sense why they wouldn't, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
incentives and benefits to do it.
Yeah,
The
if they want more
policymakers.
control, then Bitcoin helps with that actually.
Exactly. Exactly.
Because you can't track cash. You're not tracking
Exactly.
cash. So but then
Exactly.
there's the whole topic of the CBDC. We don't have to get into that today, right? The central bank digital
Right.
currency, how they could implement a sort of like a ledger system or blockchain technology into their own government backed currency, right? So or central bank
Right.
currency, I should say. Yeah.
Now, the only problem I see with that is it doesn't fix the financial problem.
Hmm.
It doesn't
Yeah,
fix the
absolutely.
monetary policy, etc. Things, right? They still have control, and we're gonna run into the same issue just
Yeah.
digitally. You know?
I think I may have heard this somewhere, or maybe I'm making it up. But the world is already digital.
Yeah,
They would just make it more digital.
that's
That's
it.
all they're doing. They're not
That's
fixing
exactly it.
anything else.
That's exactly it. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's an interesting kind of play. So back to kind of the video, I agree with most of his points. I do understand it. There are a couple of things happening in the world that I think kind of that might potentially go against what he was saying. It's just the world is very complex, right? Like we always say, "Oh, this will never happen," and brush it off. But like nobody expected 2008, right?
Hmm.
Except for a few people, and they were kind of ringing the bells, and everyone's like, "Don't worry about it." Same with these banking failures, right? People say that I'm currently reading a paper on this. SVP isn't the only one that has uninsured debt, right? They were one
Oh,
with the
yeah.
highest amount of uninsured debt. A lot of
Hmm.
other banks are in similar situations, and some people say, "Oh, well, you could hedge." You could, but you can only hedge like a certain amount. You can't hedge like 5% difference. You know what I mean? Like in
Hmm.
terms of nobody expected that much of a rate hike, but in a year's time, they went from like a percent to 5%, which is insane. Like who expected that?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think it'd be interesting to see what happens June 1st if they actually come up with a deal. They likely will. As I said before, never say never.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between possible and probable, right? I don't think it's impossible, but it's definitely pretty low on the probability scale of it happening. I want
Yeah,
to say that
agreed.
this that way, right? I wouldn't say it's never going to happen. It can happen, but the
Yeah,
probability of it is extremely low because of just the again the size of the US dollar currency and I feel like the as much as people shit on the government and Federal Reserve and people in politics, at the end of the day, they've done enough to keep the system running the way it's running, where it's like
Right.
it feels broken, but it works for what it does.
Yeah. No, that's fair. Like, I feel like I agree with that. I do think there are a couple smart people there, obviously, but
Yeah.
there's probably also a lot of smart people at SVP, you know? So either they're willfully ignorant or they're stupid, right?
Yeah.
Literally, those are the two only options, because then otherwise, why would you do that? There's other incentives. So it's like, I do think that SVB, like, they've messed up pretty bad. But is it only their fault to take? Maybe. Or was it the fact that Federal Reserve rates like to a ridiculous amount in a short period of time, right? Should they have known? Maybe. Like, a lot of banks probably did hedge. My point being is there's a lot of factors in the world, and sometimes we think, okay, because it logically makes sense that this should never happen. It's the US Reserve. It would literally destroy the world financial system. But we just had COVID. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
the world was shut down.
Yeah.
Nobody had ever expected that to ever happen, but it did,
Hmm.
right? And it changed the world in ways that we're still gonna be feeling 10 to 15 years from now, right?
Absolutely.
Forever. Like, as in, like, it's not a change that's gonna. There's certain changes that have gone in and are gonna stay like that. And so to say that this would never happen, or like you said, I really like that explanation. It's like, it's not probable. Even having that small probability, that scares me, because I'm like, that is scary. And there's some people who be like, this won't happen. It's stupid. And that's the point that
Yeah.
gets me. I'm like, don't say that'll never happen, because there
Yeah.
have been things that we thought would never happen and they've happened. And so
Yeah.
that's my only point. So don't take it like, oh, it would never happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I agree.
It'll be interesting to see. Though they have, I just saw an article today. The Republicans kind of are putting a bill through. I think it passed to kind of repeal Biden's student debt.
Oh, really?
Yes, the forgiveness bill. They're trying to repeal that. And so he said he's going to veto it, but they have a lot of leverage right now. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I never understood that. I guess we're jumping into another topic, but I never understood his reasoning for the student forgiveness.
Right. So a lot of people say, because it's insane how much debt people have taken on just for their education. Like, people would be like 40, 45 paying off this debt, right?
Yeah.
That's insane. Like, you've
Yeah.
worked 20 years, 25 years after school, and you're still paying off this debt. It's like a freaking mortgage, right?
Yeah.
You're paying off two mortgages. That's insane. So it's
And
like,
it's the one thing that you can't claim bankruptcy on.
yeah, exactly. Which is
Yeah.
like mind-boggling to me. And so I'm just like, how does anybody, deal with that? And in America, it's not just like, ours is like 20 grand, or like, sorry, like 15 grand a year. Theirs is like freaking 40.
Yeah.
Like,
Depending on the
it's
school, yeah.
insane. Yeah, people rack up like hundreds and thousands of dollars of debt just to get an
Yeah.
education, and no job will pay that much, or not many. And so how are most people going to be able to pay that back, right? So I get why
Yeah.
he did it. At the same time, if they don't pay that back, the government can't just, they're not in a position to forgive it, right?
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. It's like, where are you other like, okay, you're gonna print it, but what's that gonna do? Like,
Exactly, exactly. So, what do
uh,
you think about this? The fact that, or not the fact, but there's a lot of things at play. They're saying how they're not going to be able to, the interest payments on the debt is going to be, I think, like 30 to 40% of how much they're doing in terms of revenue. Eventually, it's just going to keep ballooning. Like, what do you think about that? Like, how do they get past
well, wouldn't they have to? They'd have to make sure that the GDP growth continues, right? In order to offset that somehow, they'd
that? Yeah,
have to keep producing as a country in order to offset the interest payment. And that's the only thing I could see. I don't know how else they would get around that. To be honest, print more. I don't know.
yeah. And that's my point. It's like, right now they'll
Yeah,
get past the this hurdle of like June 1st. They might like extend the budget, whatever, or debt ceiling. But eventually something's got to give. And when they hit that stride, then they're going to be backed into a corner. And that's when I think this kind of viewpoint that Peter was talking about might change,
yeah,
right? Because numbers don't lie. Like, eventually something's got to give.
yeah. Absolutely.
All right. Well, this was a
All right.
good episode. I think I'm excited to see what Peter talks about in the next episode. To be honest, I want to know what that country was,
Yeah, we should do a part two of this for sure.
for sure. All right. Check
React to
out,
his follow-up video.
exactly. Check it out, guys. When we release part 2. Take care.